And now, your daily dose of debate, breaking news, and uncensored views. This is the Michael Medved Show.
And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth. And what is it that makes it the greatest nation on God's green earth? Nobody has written more persuasively or meaningfully or insightfully on that subject than my friend David French. He is now an opinion columnist for the New York Times, where he writes about law, culture, religion, and armed conflict. He has a distinguished service record, speaking of armed conflict, having been part of America's war in Iraq. He is the author, most recently, of a book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. And you have a new piece about J.D. Vance and how he fits in terms of his peculiar criticism of capitalism in America.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a democratic socialist by any means, but he does have problems with capitalism, the conservative Republican vice president. What's his criticism of this system that has blessed all of us so prodigiously?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Michael. So his criticism is that the kind of capitalism that we've long enjoyed in this country was fine for a while, but now it's not because the people are not Christian enough. In other words, you have to have a certain level of Christianity in the culture for capitalism to work. And he literally says, talking about Milton Friedman as sort of a stand-in for economic freedom, that in the 1980s, when Milton Friedman's ideas were ascendant, Christian institutions were very strong, and they're not strong now. And so therefore, there's a need for a firmer top-down government hand. Now, Michael, you and I are both old enough to have remembered the 1980s. And I will tell you, and any younger listeners, that was not the time of peak piety in the United States of America.
Despite the fact that President Reagan was president. But what does he go into any detail in his book about communion or in anything he said about why he is led to this very peculiar idea that America was a land of surging religiosity back in the 1980s?
Now, it's just an assertion without evidence. I mean, look, if you go back to the 1980s, and again, you and I are both admirers of Ronald Reagan. I would call myself a Reagan conservative, but he was not the Pope of the United States. I mean, this was the President of the United States, and he was president at a time where, and a lot of these things improved under his watch, but this was a reality. The divorce rate was a lot higher than it is now. 1980 was, by some measures, the peak divorce rate in the United States. Crime was much higher than it is now. The rate of abortion was much higher than it is now, much higher. And look, there are some things that are worse now than then, but this sort of idea that we've kind of been this very deeply Christian nation that has been in a decline, and such a decline that we now need this firm hand from the government to really begin to regulate our choices. It's just fantastical. And he kind of argues, and he argues this explicitly in his book, that we took Christianity and replaced it with sort of soulless economics as the measure of well-being. And that is also just fiction. There are certainly in this world some people who would view themselves as like entirely economic creatures. They are all about maximizing economic return. If those people exist, I've not met them. I know that people view economics as part of the whole life. It's one part of the whole. It is not the whole. And so he's created this straw man, a purely economics-oriented society, and a fantasy of a deeply Christian past that wasn't, and then he's manufacturing forward an ideology of government state control of the economy. And it's a really remarkable thing to see from the sitting Republican vice president of the United States.
Okay, just to go back to this question about is America more or less religious than it was, say, 30 years ago? And in terms of that measure, people usually measure church attendance,
Right.
affiliation, people's regularity of Bible study or Torah study. But is there any significant evidence that we are deeply less religious
I
or
think
more
there's
religious today than we
yeah.
were in the 1980s?
So I don't think there's much question that there is declining religious affiliation since the 1980s. But I do think it's very important to put this in a much larger context, because the larger context is when we were actually creating this society with the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, we were much less church attending than we are now.
Hmm.
So, this is something that a lot of people get in their minds is just false. That is essentially, if you go back to, say, 1776, you had a godly nation and godly founders, and it's just been sort of a steady decline since then. No, that's not the case at all. We have had ebbs and flows in American religious affiliation. America's always been a very religious society, no question. We are still a very religious society. We're the most religious, especially of the Christian religion, of all of the Western democracies. So we've always been a very religious society, but it's ebbed and flowed. But I would also question, and I would also say that church attendance is a very thin metric for religiosity
You
and
bet.
virtue.
You
It's
bet.
a very thin metric.
What does the vice president have in mind in terms of the government's role in fostering, encouraging, energizing religious faith? What can the government do in that direction?
That's very unclear, Michael. That's very unclear.
And
What
very
what he seems
dangerous.
and very dangerous. What he seems to be doing is essentially taking what you might call an Orbanist approach. And so if you go and you look at Hungary, and there are an enormous number of sort of ties between JD Vance. He's one degree removed. Heck, he went to Hungary to help Orban, to essentially campaign for Orban. That's how close they were. But Orban was taking a very statist, command and control approach to Hungary's economy, Hungary's civil liberties. He was a democratically elected authoritarian. And this is somebody that Vance and a lot of people in his orbit have admired a great deal. Now, he comes in and he was very explicitly Christian when he came in. Did he make Hungary more Christian? No. Did he make Hungary richer? No. In fact, Hungary began to fall behind some of its Eastern European peers, like Poland, for example. If you look at the economic progress of Hungary under this command and control economy, it hasn't done as well. So it's not more religious. It's not more prosperous. What are we doing here, Michael? What are we doing here? And I think the other thing to point out is a lot of the ideas, there's no wonder that J.D. Vance is scorning economics, because economics tells us that a lot of the ideas that he and the Trump administration have advanced are bad ideas. They won't actually accomplish the goals that the Trump administration has set.
What's one example?
Okay, here's a great example. The use of tariffs. The use of tariffs
Oh, boy.
as both a sort of revenue producer combined with effort to revitalize American manufacturing. This is something that has a very poor track record on all counts. And in fact, to the extent that American manufacturing is surging, the best evidence says it's in spite of the tariffs, not because of them. And so we have seen tariffs increase the costs of manufactured goods. That's not something that's helping manufacturing. We've seen manufacturing job losses, for example. It's very much like when Democrats go for rent control. Good intentions, doesn't work.
Okay, we will be back about what works and what doesn't work in terms of foreign policy. David's written another powerful column about heading toward a much more disastrous and devastating war than we're already in Iran. We'll get to that and more with David French coming up on The Medved Show. And on the Michael Medved Show, it's always a pleasure and an honor to speak with David French, who is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. I would say he is probably by a pretty good margin of advantage the most conservative voice at the New York Times. And God bless him for it. One of his new pieces is "The War That Could Swallow the World." Whatever is happening in Iran, it isn't working. David, briefly, how could this war, which seems to be limited to the Middle East at the moment, how could it end up swallowing the world?
Well, one of the things that I point out is that we're already seeing it spread, not just in the Middle East, but potentially into Europe and linking in some ways with the Russia-Ukraine war. So, for example, we have seen Ukrainian strikes, including of an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, and so which created a potential for direct military confrontation between Iran and Ukraine. We are seeing Russia helping Iran in its war with the United States by, intelligence reports indicate, providing intel and assisting in targeting. We're seeing it spread perhaps as China is reportedly beginning to rearm Iran. We are seeing it spread within the Middle East as the Houthis have now brought the Red Sea back into the fray. And we're seeing Putin spreading the war in Ukraine, as we have now, Michael, seen day after day after day, armed drone incursions into NATO territory. And the point that I was making in the piece is that all of this is happening at the same time, much like August 1914. And this is a situation where I do not want to be, I don't think a world war is likely. I don't think it's certain. I don't think it's likely, but it's more possible than it's been any time since the end of the Cold War. And one of the reasons is very similar to July and August 1914. Nobody really seems to be in command of events here, that everyone is reacting to each other. And this is also a product of the loss of American leadership in the West, that we are now in a position where, in many ways, it feels as if we are not in control. And we are not able to contain the conflicts that we start. And that's a new thing in the last 20 to 30 years. We're very used to being in control of the conflicts. There was not much concern that the Afghan war would spread. There was not much concern that the Iraq war would spread because we were in control of these conflicts. But right now, as American deterrence is under question, as America retreats from its leading role, as it conducts the Iran war ineffectively, we are in a position where we are not in command of events. Hostile actors are perhaps even in more command of events than we are, and it's a very dangerous moment.
Okay, right now it appears, and there was a big speech statement by the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Bessent, and the indication appears to be that the Trump focus has changed from military action by the United States to economic pressure by the United States. First of all, do you think that is going on? And second of all, is that a way to win the war or at least to get out of the war?
You know, it is a transition to an economic strategy given the military constraints around an air power alone campaign and the way in which Iran has been able to very effectively damage American and allied forces throughout the region to such an extent that there's now open discussion of pulling American forces back. The economic path might have a better chance. It does have the virtue of being less violent, which helps control the spread of the conflict. You might have a better path to success applying putting extreme economic costs on Iran. But we shouldn't hold out too much hope, Michael. This is a nation that spent hundreds of thousands of lives in the Iraq war, that killed between 30 and 40,000 of its own citizens. It does not care. This regime does not care about the suffering of its own people, especially if it sees that it can secure some sort of strategic advantage. It will absolutely it will absolutely push their own people to the limit to confront the United States. And so I'm not sure we've factored that into our calculus. We were acting as if this was a country much more like, say, an allied country that might respond to economic pressure rather than a jihadist tyranny that will waste and expend as many of its citizens' lives as it feels appropriate to advance its goals. And that's a different kind of strategic nut to crack.
I have another follow-up question, which troubles me very deeply, which is we have not been successful with economic pressure in stopping Russia from its attacks on Ukraine. And Russia is a country which, more than Iran certainly, is concerned about the fate of its people. They made these huge sacrifices to devastate Ukraine. So if economic pressure isn't going to work with Russia, why should it work with the jihadists in Iran?
There's no evidence that it will. None. Zero. And in fact, often the longer you put in economic pressure on a country, the more they learn workarounds. Russia has been very successful at being able to sell oil. And in fact, the Iran war temporarily helped Russia a great deal by spiking oil prices, which Russia was able to take advantage of and boost its own economy. So here's the thing. Sanctions do bite. They do have a consequence. But we don't have a whole lot of track record, just like we don't have a whole lot of track record with air power alone. We don't have a track record with sanctions alone bringing a totalitarian country to heel, especially one with powerful allies like Russia or China.
That's something that we need to absorb. Can we gain control, or is it somehow too late? That's one of the questions asked by David French in his columns. Those columns are posted at our website at michaelmedved.com. And David, do we get out of the war successfully before the midterm elections?
No, I do not think so. I don't think Iran will let us out before the midterms.
What a horrible, horrible reality. I'm afraid that the evidence is in favor of your analysis. We will be right back. David French, Godspeed to you, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Michael.
Listeners love Michael Medved.
I listen to you occasionally when I'm driving. It turns my stomach every time I do.
Lately, you've been sounding like a raving lunatic. You upset me so much. You never tell the truth.
I truly believe you're delusional.
You don't have a clue.
You're wrong again.
What's going on in your head? You are no good for the country. People like you who are a monster. Have you no shame?
The Michael Medved Show.
And on the Michael Medved Show, there is a local story in Seattle that is gaining attention around the world. Why? Well, because it's a story about a very popular and well-respected columnist for the Seattle Times. His name is Matt Calkins. He's worked with the Seattle Times, which is the leading newspaper in the Northwest, frankly. And he's worked for the Seattle Times for more than 11 years. He just resigned from the newspaper. Why? Because they refused to run his story about girls speaking out against biological men in girls' sports. Now, Calkins had a podcast interview about why he felt it was necessary to resign on the spot when the Times brass spiked his column. This is clip 11.
Well, basically, I tried to write a column through the eyes of two student athletes who were kind of speaking out against biological males in girls/women's sports. And I submitted this column a couple Fridays ago to my editors. And this was kind of on the heels of a rally outside of Climate Pledge Arena where girls were supporting Sophie Cunningham and her stance on this issue. And, basically 6 days went by and they said, "Oh, we're looking at it. Let me give it to this editor. This editor is going to have a talk with the top two editors." And 6 days later, they decided it wasn't going to run. And I had a feeling it wasn't going to run based on past experiences with columns getting spiked. And I just decided to resign on the spot. And as I mentioned in a Substack that I wrote, it sounds like an emotional decision, sounds like a rage quit kind of thing. It wasn't something I was totally ready to do, just because I felt, I couldn't do my job as a columnist because I feel like they were, stifling my voice.
With the idea that they wouldn't even run an opinion piece, this was no kind of claim that Calkins misrepresented the girls he was writing about or violated any basic rules of journalism or journalistic integrity. And he explained the way they tried to justify his finding his piece censored by the Seattle Times. Here's Matt Calkins again, clip 10.
All they said was that you didn't tell us you were doing this in advance, so we can't run it. But I didn't buy the excuse. I constantly will pitch stories to editors, a few hours before it's going to print. Now, obviously, this had a little more, this was a little more controversial than, hey, the Mariners, Julio Rodriguez should be moved to the middle spot of the order, for the Mariners. There's a little more potential blowback for this. But I didn't disrupt anything by sending it in early. It's not like I surprised anyone. It's not like anyone was caught off guard in the meeting. I just said, "Hey, you want to take a look at this?" I wanted to make sure it was a polished draft before anybody got it. So I had it ready to go. I said, "No rush to run this." But I kind of had a feeling that it was going to end like that.
Okay, this is one of those things where I would guess that there were deeper issues that were provoking Matt Calkins to give up his job and to resign from the newspaper. Because, frankly, this is one of those issues that impacts so few people in the United States. And by the way, I completely agree with Matt Calkins, who appears to have the same attitude that I think the overwhelming majority of Americans do, which is that it is unfair to female athletes to have biological males competing against them. There are differences between men and women. And for instance, no other candidate, prominent candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, could advertise a campaign with basically freezing her own eggs and going through fertility surgical proceedings. I mean, that's the difference between men and women. And the idea that there might be some girls, some female athletes, who themselves are deeply uncomfortable with this very rare reality, it makes the entire issue bigger than it frankly should be. And I do believe that eventually it's going to be worked out, and it partially will be worked out because it's not just the United States. It is a round the world issue. And meanwhile, there is another issue that I think is extremely important and has been raised as a center for the Democratic Socialists and other people on the far left of the Democratic Party. You remember they talk about Medicare for all? And Thomas Beck, who is a former executive with HCA Healthcare, has a column in today's Wall Street Journal. The Medicare for all math doesn't add up. The notion of a Medicare for all system is enjoying a revival. Democratic primary victories by candidates who champion single-payer health care most notably U.S. Senate candidates Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan and Peggy Flanagan in Minnesota, have pushed the proposal back into the healthcare debate. What these candidates fail to understand or refuse to acknowledge is that applying Medicare payment rates to all services provided to all patients would destroy the American healthcare system. The debate usually centers on taxes and the role of government, but there is a more fundamental question. Could America's hospitals survive if every patient were reimbursed at Medicare rates? The answer is no. This isn't ideology, it's math. Congress's Medicare Payment Advisory Commission estimates that hospitals lost about 12 cents on every Medicare dollar they received in 2024. And projects that Medicare margins will remain roughly 10% below the break-even point in 2026. These losses are sustainable. Those losses are sustainable only because Medicare is one part of a mixed payer system. The other main part is commercial insurance. A 2024 RAND study found that private insurers pay hospitals on average more than 2.5 times Medicare rates. Those much higher payments help support emergency departments, trauma centers, neonatal intensive care units, behavioral health programs, teaching hospitals, and rural facilities, as well as investments in technology, cybersecurity, and emergency preparedness. In other words, you want to wreck our healthcare system? Yeah, then talk about Medicare for all. Doesn't work and doesn't add up. We will be right back on The Medved Show.
Listeners love Michael Medved.
I listen to you occasionally when I'm driving. It turns my stomach every time I do.
Lately, you've been sounding like a raving lunatic. You upset me so much. You never tell the truth.
I truly believe you're delusional.
You don't have a clue.
You're wrong again.
What's going on in your head? You are no good for the country. People like you who are a monster. Have you no shame?
The Michael Medved Show.
And on the Michael Medved Show, there is a tendency that we have to honor people with musical achievements who you wouldn't expect would be making those contributions to our artistic culture. Last week, we talked about Boy George. Remember Boy George? Well, he did a reggae song in support of Israel, which created all kinds of controversy, of course, but bless him for that. Boy George is not Jewish. He has no vested interest in Israel, but he has been a defender of Israel's right to exist. And somebody else who is not noted particularly for musical brilliance has come up with her own song. I'm talking about Rosie O'Donnell, who has been filling in for Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel has taken it's a more than a month's long vacation from bashing President Trump and entertaining many Americans, not all. But Rosie O'Donnell, replacing Jimmy Kimmel, closed her final monologue with a song, a traditional Irish song. Well, she's O'Donnell, of course, traditional Irish name. And this is the subject of one of our eagerly awaited Medved Music Reviews.
The Michael Medved Music Review. Covering the creative geniuses whose timeless artistry can move us, inspire us, and enrich our lives. And now, it's time for the Michael Medved Music Review. As
presented directly by Rosie O'Donnell closing her final monologue on the Jimmy Kimmel Show.
Close my final monologue here with a traditional Irish song dedicated to a very special boy. Oh, Donny boy, it's Rosie, Rosie calling from Hollywood, the Jimmy Kimmel Show. Drop that Big Mac that we all know you're holding, because, my dear, I worry for you so. Poor Donny boy, your polls are falling. Your reflecting pool is green as Mountain Dew. Your wig's a mess. Your ballroom is appalling. And with Iran, you bit off more than you can chew. Measles are back. Inflation is a swelling. You post all night. You're sleeping while you work. And what's with all this useless crap you're selling? Hey, sweetie pie, you're driving us all berserk.
That's not the end yet. She was driven even more climactically berserk, as expressed in the conclusion of her memorable song. This is clip 19.
But there's a way to end this drama. It's time to use that stable genius brain. Since we all know you'll never be Obama. Why not resign and make this country great again? Yes, we all know you'll never be Obama. Come on, resign and make this country great again.
Jeremy, has there been a response from the White House yet on this contribution to our culture? Yeah, again, Trump could sing one in response and say, well, of course I'll never be Obama. I don't want to be Obama. But it does speak a little bit to the idea of resignation is all they can hope for, because he is legally elected. There's no question he won the election, and he gets to serve for 2 years plus more as president of the United States. And again, the more people talk about fantasies about President Trump resigning or because of health issues being forced out of office, I think that's a very, very much of a long shot. But that doesn't stop people from who are close to President Trump in particular. And no, this is not another reference to Natalie Harp. That's a different story. Somebody else who's close in a different way, but certainly close in a policy way, is Markwayne Mullin, the former senator from Oklahoma, who is now the Secretary of Homeland Security. And he makes a very dubious assertion about how to prevent death. No, that's seriously what he's talking about. This is clip 17.
Underneath President Trump's leadership, we're almost at 16 months with zero illegals released into this country. And by the way, these same authorities that the president has used to secure our border, President Biden could have done the same thing, but he chose not to. And so every single death. So when you said a while ago that the blood is on their hands, you're absolutely correct, Sean, because every single death that has occurred by an illegal that was released into this country underneath the Biden administration, every one of those is 100% preventable. And the Biden administration turned a blind eye, and thank God the American people put President Trump back in office. He used his authority and he secured our border, the most secure it's ever been in history.
Okay, first of all, when you talk about the most it's ever been secured in history, if you look back at immigration history, there have been very few limitations on the immigration to the United States. There wasn't a big national immigration restriction bill until 1924. And it was not aimed at Latinos. It was not aimed at Africans or even at Asians in particular, though they caught some of the enmity. But it was aimed mostly at Italians and Jews and people from Italy, from Poland, mostly Jewish people from Poland, and from Russia. Where, again, that was part of Tsarist policy, used to be to get the Jews out of the country. But this idea that every illegal immigrant is going to be responsible for killings and for death rates, again, there have been literally dozens of authoritative studies and analysis and numbers. And people who are here as immigrants are less likely to commit murder and other crimes of violence than people who are born in the United States. And so this notion that the death of anyone in a violent crime, first of all, the odds are very much against the idea that person committing that kind of crime will be an illegal immigrant. But if we can focus on actually concentrating on what President Trump originally promised, which was to concentrate on people who are career criminals, who have gang involvements, who have criminal records, and to go after them with your ICE program. And that's why you have Markwayne Mullin talking about this as Secretary of the Homeland Security. Coming up, could it be the greatest speech of all time? It was brief and it was impromptu. But a presidential historian says we can all learn from Ronald Reagan's remarks at the Republican National Convention in 1976 that electrified this greatest nation on God's green earth.